Hello, this is Dr. John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy and the Food Fraud Prevention Think Tank, and this is my pre-conference review version of my presentation, Food Fraud Prevention, Counterfeit Food and Beverages, for the conference Tackling Counterfeit Food and Beverages, presented by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office and the Global Intellectual Property Academy here on May 26th, 2021. If you have more requests for information or would like to know more about our activities, you can see our website, foodfraudprevention.com, or follow us on Twitter. Let's get started. So first, just very briefly about us. So Food Fraud Prevention Think Tank, we're a unique, specific entity, and we have several resources that are a real key to what we do. First off, everything from my research, our research, has been summarized in the Food Fraud Prevention textbook, and that was published in 2019. You'll see that on the right with the QR code and the link to that. It's a really comprehensive overview, applies to countries as well as companies as well. And our main information source, our main outreach are our massive open online courses, MOOCs. They're free, open, and online. There's a certificate of completion based on assessments. Generally, it's on demand with 10 professional training hours. We've got a wide range of courses and content, from the first one, the most basic Food Fraud Prevention Overview MOOC that's been offered continuously since 2013. Then we've got other ones, audit guides, help looking at the vulnerability assessments. We went in more detail with the Organic Trade Association and looked at organic fraud prevention. And then more broadly, stepped back and looked at enterprise risk management. This is looking at assessing the risks enterprise-wide in a broad way. This does include application to governments, including examples from the U.S. government. And then very recently worked on a project with USDA to create training for them with the Organic Trade Association. And these are great overviews of concepts that were for training of USDA National Organic Program Inspectors. But they provide a lot of background on the problem itself, and then preventing product fraud, specifically organic product fraud. And then in normal times we do a lot of executive education on site around the country, around the world, and then on our website we have a wide range of other types of resources and materials. So please feel free to access those. So when thinking about this presentation, it was interesting to go back and look at what I've presented before to USPTO, and specifically the Global Intellectual Property Academy. So I looked back, and it was way back in 2010 was my first presentation. The basic concepts haven't changed. So it's interesting, actually kind of nice to see that the concepts haven't changed. So if we did any activities, it started them back then. The terminology, the concepts are really the same. Here we are, over 10 years later. Then I presented a longer workshop seminar. So this was 2 hours of content on anti-counterfeit strategy. At this point, we were still looking very much at intellectual property rights and general counterfeiting, but we used food fraud as an example. And you'll notice that image that I used there of the rivers, that'll show up in a couple more slides. And then 2013 went into this whole idea of enterprise risk management. And what I'll say is, remember this last slide, because the final thoughts for USPTO are the final thoughts that I still have, plus a few things that are more applied. And so the phrase that came up was the what to the how to start and how much. Over time, we've evolved. And at the very beginning was the what and the how a bit, or really more of the what. And then over 11 years, really developed with the food industry a lot of really practical applications that we'll present to you in these next few slides. So the resources, there's a lot of resources for you, and I figured I'd start with this slide. A lot of times we use resources or provide resources at the end. I really want you to know that there's information here. There's a lot of support, there's a lot of guidance, there's activities from around the world, and really best practices. And the first one was from November 2019. We were invited to present to Interpol Operation Ops, and that's on food crimes. And we were presenting on this country-level food fraud vulnerability assessment. So it's there. There's a link to that training video. A key is this is something that's been worked at, again, internationally and at the country level. So we've got some insight there. Another article that's really important at the very basic positions are looking at this application of public policy theory to food fraud, but it applies to all types of product fraud, including intellectual property rights. This is really a way to calibrate where the laws and regulations are as well as the enforcement and implementation, and also the success in the marketplace. So it's just a baseline to look at these public policy steps. And then we've got some articles that really provide a lot of clear recommendations. I mean, I don't know how much clearer it can get than saying implementation steps for a government agency or industry. So this was an article specifically written for this, and a couple keys there is that co-author Neil Fortin is a recognized international domestic food law lawyer, professor here at Michigan State, and Yongning Wu and Hong Miao are two senior managers, and Yongning Wu is the Chief Science Officer for the Chinese National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment, which is the body in China that oversees food fraud prevention for their country. So we've got some pretty key people there looking at these concepts and very specific, very simple, straightforward steps. And then also, if there's a need to look at evaluating how bad is bad, here was another one. These are the first and the last one have videos with them from presentations. The middle two are academic articles with their links. But this was one presented to the Food Safety Regulatory Economics Working Group, which is 5 or 10 nations. We presented that of looking at estimating the economic impact of food fraud. So there's a lot of resources there to help you out. So now to look at the concept itself, and before really giving our recommendation, I feel like it's really important to share our approach so that you understand what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, and that you have confidence in it. So we look at the science and sciences of food fraud prevention, and you'll see at the bottom here is where things started. Think of things like melamine and pet food. So the first thing was we needed to figure out what it was and what was making people and pets sick, and how to get it out of the system. So that's very much food authenticity and food safety, looking at the problems, looking at testing. But we never test our way out of into safety or out of problems. We really need to understand the root cause. And our research then shifted upwards into criminology. This is behavioral sciences because there are human adversaries that are making what they think are a rational choice. They don't think they're going to get caught. And they perceive system weaknesses, vulnerabilities, or situational crime prevention. But the root cause isn't everything. We need to take some action. So the next step up was a focus on standards and certification and public policy. Now we focused more on standards and certifications because industry is able to move faster than governments. And industry can cover multinational companies, multinational jurisdictions, and implement it at a very high level. We worked closely with the Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, which itself is a group of companies that really create the expectation for a global food safety certification. And in that, they included food fraud requirements. So once we got that, then that kind of understands public policy, but it really moves forward to an industry implementation. So now we've got a requirement. We understand the root cause. We understand how to test it. But we need to then understand how much is enough. That's really, really important because if you don't have any way to judge how much is enough, then you'll either do way too much or too little, or most problematic is you won't even start. So that's where we saw enterprise risk management. And this is something that over the years that we were working on this, really started in 2009. Enterprise risk management has gone from being a unique board level risk activity for Sarbanes-Oxley compliance to something that's integrated into the entire business. And now we see this as something even at the frontline levels of food safety and food fraud prevention, that this helps with the decision making of how much is enough. So now these are academic theories that are all just tied together. So we've got the foundation. Now we need to get it into action. That's what you see here on the left, supply chain management. Over the years, I've moved around MSU. I've moved from packaging science, looking at those areas of the product itself, into criminology and the School of Criminal Justice, into food safety groups, and then now ultimately back to supply chain management. And the key there is that we now have all these processes and we're implementing them just in a normal standard operating procedure. Just the way that quality management or focusing on sustainability, worker safety, these are all things that are now just standard operating procedures. We see that transition now of food fraud prevention, and this applies to all product fraud, including intellectual property rights. So what is food fraud? Intentional deception for economic gain using food. Now that is a broad term, and that's more than just intellectual property rights. The key, and that's important. That's actually very important because an entity, an entire company, or a country is looking at the whole problem. And if you only look at part of the problem, then you only stop that one part of the problem. And with product fraud, the bad guys are trying to commit some type of fraud, not specifically counterfeiting. It could be stolen goods. Stolen goods are easier than counterfeiting. They don't even have to make anything. They don't have to even, they just steal it and sell it. So the key is that focusing on one part of crime will just disperse that crime to other areas, displace the crime. So we really do need to look at this holistic approach of all economic gain for food, all aspects. This broad definition is consistent with GFSI, Global Food Safety Initiative, the European Commission, EU work, UK, ISO, and others. It includes a subcategory of economically motivated adulteration, or EMA. And in the US, you might be more familiar with that term. And to note, very important note, is FDA currently defines EMA as a substance for economic gain. That's only a part of food fraud. It's not all fraud. The motivation is economic gain. And that's a real key when we're looking at the root cause. If we disrupt their abilities to make money for economic gain, then we disrupt the opportunity. That's a real key. It's important at the very start to talk about just the term food defense, because that's another term that's used very much in the US, and a lot of times people think that food fraud prevention is clearly already covered under food defense. It is not. The key is food defense is different because the motivation is traditionally harm or terror. For food fraud, the motivation is economic gain. And, well, specifically, if you're good at food fraud, no one gets sick because no one knows there's even a problem with the product. So those are very different. And even in more detail, the US FDA focuses on the Food Safety Modernization Act, the IA rule, intentional adulteration rule, is limited to wide-scale harm to public health. That's a real key, is that so even if you think it's under food defense, it's definitely not under the intentional adulteration rule. So food fraud is different and separate from food defense. The effect, there's always an economic threat, always with food fraud, with every type of food fraud. Now, that's a key and well known. Now, regarding public health, there's not always a public health threat, but there is always a public health vulnerability. What we mean by that is that if someone puts a chemical in the product to try to deceive a test, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be a product that harms people. Melamine it was intended to melamine not, but melamine combined with other contaminants in the product created the harm. So there wasn't an imminent threat, but then there was a vulnerability because we don't know what products are in there, what chemicals are in there. And that then led to the possibility that melamine could combine with other types of contaminants and create this harm. This is why the food industry focuses on this so much and why they took the lead. Because within an agency, once melamine or horse meat and beef didn't have a public health threat, that went from a public health agency like FDA or USDA to FBI or some other agency, and with normal proper priority setting, that would be a very low priority. So that's the key, is that who's going to be responsible for this. Now, when there's a clear public health threat, that's clear, and there's a lot of activity, but there's not for just a vulnerability. Now, it's still illegal, but we have to prioritize. This again is why the food industry started to focus on it so much. So what is food fraud? Now, food fraud here is in the middle. This is defined by GFSI, which again is key because GFSI sets the expectation for all food safety, all commercial, private industry food safety certifications. You might be more familiar with BRC, IFS, FSSC 22000, SQF, or others, but GFSI sets the foundation. And they look at all the types of fraud that could occur. Dilution, substitution, and containment, those are traditional substances. Gray market theft and diversion, that can be a root cause. Tampering, so tampering could be just date code tampering, labeling, mislabeling. Unimproved enhancements, so different ways the product is monitored or modified along the way. Could be production overruns. So a contract manufacturer just makes too much product. And clearly in here as well is counterfeiting, and defined here as intellectual property rights counterfeiting. All types of food fraud. A key is the bad guys are trying to find some way to commit fraud. They're not trying to do just contaminant or gray market or tampering or counterfeiting. They're trying to do any of these. And if you stop one of these, they're just going to shift to something else in most cases. Now, the US FDA focuses on economically motivated adulteration, which is really a substance, and that's up here really in these areas on the top. Something added to the product. Counterfeiting might be in there, but really this is looking at more common production. Now, key is it's really academic to define the terms because all of it's illegal. and all fraud is the focus. And again, that's a key with the UK, the European Union, GFSI, China, ISO, and others. And actually, under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act and U.S. food laws, these are all illegal under adulterated foods or misbranded foods sections. So key is the focus from industry needs to be on all types of fraud. And that's really valuable for governments when they're looking at this as well, because we can mirror that and we can stop all the vulnerabilities, or we can work to reduce all the vulnerabilities for that fraudster. This is just a reference, so it's in the slide deck. If you need a lot more detail on those types of product fraud, they're listed here. So how do we go about prevention? Well, we go to the field of criminology. And in criminology, we think of a human adversary. And what we're trying to do is prevention. Crime prevention, that's been a real key. Since the mid-70s, there's been a major focus shifting from catching bad guys and putting them in jail to really trying to reduce the fraud opportunity. Now look on the right for the crime opportunity. There's a function here, victim, fraudster, and the guardian and hurdle gaps. These all work together to create a fraud opportunity, and with that you need to have that motivated offender. Now you could have a really vulnerable system that never gets defrauded. Or you could have a system that's very, very defended and still gets attacked. That motivated offender is key there. Where we can focus this prevention activity is on the guardian and hurdle gaps. It's looking at the systems and doing as much as we can to reduce the fraud opportunity. We can help educate the victim so they're not as much of a victim, but really it's this opportunity is to really increase the risk of getting caught or the cost of conducting the crime. Now the fraudster as well can sometimes be addressed directly, but we'll never arrest our way out of this. I mean, think about how many criminals there are in the world, or people possibly that could be open to committing a crime, and then think about fraud is really even less, where it's not so many cases not really considered a crime. And the key was situational crime prevention. This is a real breakthrough in our research that shifted the focus to that prevention approach. First thing we always have to do is be able to detect it. So things like horse meat and beef, melamine and pet food, we need to be able to detect that. That's always going to be the most complex scientific activity here, but it's not the end. We then put other programs in place such as to deter or prevent. And deter is if we know a specific type of action, like putting a substance in to deceive a protein test, or a specific type of fraud that occurs at a border or something like that. We can put in specific actions to deter, but overall we want to prevent. We want to put systems in place that lead the bad guys to feel like it's just not worth trying to get that product across, because if it does get caught, it's so bad that it's just not even worth trying. A key, can't emphasize it enough, for a company level, for an industry level, or for a country, and is to reduce the entire vulnerability. And if you're only looking at one of those types of fraud, such as intellectual property rights counterfeiting, you're just moving the crime around. You're just displacing it. They're just going to move from one type of fraud to another. So a real key is to step back and look at the big picture. And I realize at this point that it seems really like a daunting task, or really nearly impossible to think of multi-agencies working together, things like that. But bear with me for a moment. We'll get through this to look at the vision here. But that's the key. If we look at it, we have to look at it from the way the bad guy looks at it. We have to reduce and prevent all their opportunities. So we have with adapting countermeasures to specific attacks and attackers, or we leave gaps if we don't focus. A key is to coordinate all prevention to identify the most efficient role of each actor. So you can define what is your most important role and what is your efficient role. And that sounds kind of daunting, again, to figure out. But let's look at a simple question. If we're trying to stop a boat from going down a river, how would we do that? Well, one simple thing you could do here, I admit that this is just very simplistic, but if we're looking at the big picture of this, this big boat, we've now identified the problem of it moving down the river. We could put one big rock in the middle of the river. Now, how much does that cost? Not much. And as long as you drive by every once in a while and make sure that rock is still there, then the boat is still blocked, then you're good. Now that's not monitoring it. It's not a wall. It's not a border. It's not a gate. It's not a fence. It's just a big old rock in the middle of the river. Now let's say over time we look at that and we find out that the bad guys are using smaller boats. So that one rock doesn't work. They can slip through. Well, here's rocket science here. Let's put in two rocks. So again, we've adapted, but how much does that cost? How much effort is involved there? Really not much. As long as we put those rocks in and they're good rocks, and we keep monitoring that the boat size doesn't change again, and monitor occasionally that those rocks are still there and they don't get moved by the bad guys, then we're efficient. We don't need to do any more. And this could be a quarter of what you're already doing. But the key is we're looking at the overall fraud opportunity and we're identifying the specific role of blocking that ship. We're not trying to stop the ships from being bought or sold or the product getting on the ship. We're disrupting the entire operation by doing this. Now, as we keep moving forward, then maybe there's different things going on. What about a fish, big fish or a whale going down the river? Now, those rocks aren't going to stop that. Maybe we look for it and we catch it. I think this is something like large-scale smuggling coming across the border. If we think it's semi-trucks full of stolen cell phones or currency or things like that, well, we can look for the big whales coming through. But really what we find is that over time, like with counterfeiting, is the bad guys have shifted from those shipping containers coming into the country to small parcels. That might be like a whole bunch of fish. And what the Intellectual Property Rights Center has done is shifted focus to basically have a net. To now look at the key rivers, the ports, the products, how that product, the mail parcel post comes into the country, and do things like have x-ray machines there. So they've got more of a net. Now that's not the rocks in the river, because we're not worried about that anymore. You've ignored the rocks now because you're looking at this small fish as the problem. What I think really happens is that we take on the role that we're trying to stop the entire river. We're trying to stop, we say, well, we could just, to stop the boats, big boats, small boats, whales, and little fish, we could just stop the river. Well, okay, that's possible. I actually did find a great picture of Niagara Falls that was blocked when they were building some of the, or cleaning out and building some of the other dam activity up there. But I couldn't post it because I didn't have copyright permission. So I couldn't have a copyright violation in a presentation to USPTO. So you've got my other little schematic there. But what I find is most times when we think about that we're going to try to stop the entire river, really what we're doing is building a dam only partway across the river. Now, what did we accomplish here? This is by far the most costly, complex countermeasure, and it doesn't do anything. Doesn't do anything. Now with this, I mean, we don't know if it stops. We haven't defined whether it's big boats, little boats. It definitely wouldn't stop the whales or the fish. So the key is that a lot of times we take on too much, but we don't really understand what we're doing. The questions we should have are, who are the bad guys? How do they attack? Who else is working against them? Now maybe someone's already putting one rock in the river, so we can work with them and just put a second rock. That's a real key, and we want to look at this idea to coordinate these activities. That leads us then to, as whatever agency you are, whatever country you are, you're able to now answer the question, what is the simplest and most effective countermeasure? And if someone says to you, hey, what are you doing just putting a big rock in the middle of the river? Well, you now can define, well, we're trying to stop that big boat, and this blocks the big boat. We check the rock once a week. It's never moved in the 10 years we've had it there, and we don't see the big ships coming through. Wow, you just defined that you have an optimal activity. And that's a real key when we're looking at this type of scenario. So we're trying to understand the entire fraud opportunity, conduct that assessment, and then look at the most efficient way to disrupt and meet our goals. So this is following up on my March 2013, so almost 10 years, follow-up of the final thoughts. Now, a real key here is that there's a shift from really the what is this and what to do, or to the start of that, into really the how to start and how much is enough. So a lot has gone on since then, but we're building on the same basics. Focus on all product fraud. Now, this doesn't mean that if you're USPTO or Patent and Trademark Office for a country, this doesn't mean that you're also working on smuggling and dilution and things like that. But a key is, at least at the assessment level, start looking at all product fraud so you understand the big picture. When you understand the big picture, then you can identify your specific optimal role. Continue to address consumer behavior. Now, we still need to think about reminding consumers that they could be doing very dangerous activities and warning them. So don't stop doing that. Continue to address public health threats. Now, this is the food safety type systems. Let those systems keep acting. And actually, if we're looking at things like trademark infringements, let's use all the great resources that are out there that are already active in the marketplace. And that includes things like the food safety and public health response systems. Develop a methodology to, I originally said quantify the threat, but we really need to assess and assess the vulnerability. So that's a bit of an adjustment, but that's an important adjustment. And so we've got this idea. Continue to assess the optimal public-private partnership roles in prevention. So that's what we're doing here. We're starting to go through the process to say what's the optimal role of each agency, each resource. And the key is to enable that shift to prevention. Now this is where I left off before, and that was something that bugged me because we hadn't answered that. So now that we've got some new activities here, we're getting the what to the how to start and how much. We're trying to get very simple and just lay out those process steps. And you're fortunate because this has been implemented at a lot of companies. It's started to be implemented around the world, so there's been some lessons learned. First off, assess available training. So before you even get started, you should get more education on this. So things like us, we have a food fraud prevention overview. 2-hour webinars, easy. You can just listen to it while you're driving or on the elliptical or whatever. But learn the basics. Get the foundation. We've got other MOOCs. There's other programs, other training, the USDA training as well. You can get a really good foundation very quickly. You'll understand the broad concepts. Then a real key is to create this country-level food fraud vulnerability assessment. And if you say it can't be done, then go back and look at the Interpol presentation that I gave. That 2019 presentation actually is a summary. Part of it is a summary of a 2013 or 2017 Interpol presentation where I did a country-level vulnerability assessment. So it's there. It's also in the textbook, examples of how to do that. You do it at a very high level to start, but it helps you focus in. That starts to tell you where you have your problems and where you don't have problems. You can focus on the worst issues. And you start to understand why there's a vulnerability when you look at that detail. Also, follow the Food Fraud Task Force method. Now, when you look at our article on the implementation steps for governments or industry, it's got a method in there. And there's a recommendation of how to come together. Now, it could just be your agency looking at it. Let's say it's only U.S. Patent and Trademark looking at your own role in the entire U.S. to cover this topic. You could have your own task force. If no one else wants to be involved, create your own task force to look at this. Identify the big problems, and then you identify what is your specific role. If other agencies don't want to participate at this point, that's fine, but you have your own area of responsibility. And that you start with this to look at what are those key steps. So you can explain why putting 1 or 2 rocks in the river or catching the whales, what's the optimal step for you. It's a critical step. And finally, see the video resources above. So there's resources for you to get started. I'm happy to help as well. Here in the U.S. or around the world, anybody feel free to contact me. I love to do this work. It's been great to work through it. We've had some successes. We've had a lot of challenges too, but really want to work with you on this. I'm happy to share this. That's why we provide so much of the background information that if you don't work directly with us, you can find that in our resources. A lot of acknowledgments, and really like to thank the USPTO has been great over the years. Intellectual Property Rights Center, FDA, USDA, and others. So thank you very much. With that, I'll be ready to take discussion. Thank you.